Hey, welcome back to my limited series, Rave of Thrones, where we talk about each episode of the final season of Game of Thrones. I'm your host, Movie Real Rick. As before, this show does contain spoilers, so if you're not up to date, hold off on watching this review. But for those who are caught up, let's talk about this wildly unpopular episode. The episode starts off great, with Jon giving a heartfelt eulogy for all the fallen soldiers who died fighting the army of the dead. Even though he kind of just stole the General Night's Watch eulogy with the whole "we'll never see the likes of them again" line. But still heartfelt nonetheless. That night, we find the survivors having a celebratory feast, which was my favorite part of the episode because we've never really seen any victory celebrations by the good guys before. Usually, they either die, or even if they do win, they're still pretty grim because there's always so many more battles to fight. And there was a cup of Starbucks coffee sitting in front of Dany that somehow nobody noticed, and HBO had to eat crow just 1 week after insulting all of its viewers by telling us that we don't know how to work our own TVs while watching their perfect show, and that's why the Battle of Winterfell was so dark and incomprehensible. Love it. Anyway, during the feast, Dany stops Gendry as he's walking by and calls him out for being Robert Baratheon's son, reminding him that it was his father who overthrew her family's dynasty and tried to have her murdered. And I'm like, oh shit. Is she worried about this guy having a claim on the Iron Throne now too? But instead, she goes the total opposite direction and proclaims that from this moment on, he is now Gendry Baratheon, Lord of Storm's End. Cheers, Lord Gendry. But as everyone laughs and cheers, Dany scans the room and realizes that hardly anyone is left from her own entourage. And as Tormund showers Jon with praise for being an ultimate badass, Dany realizes that it's Jon, not her, who's the real power in Westeros, and the one who everyone looks up to here. Next starts a long line of rejections. Brienne rejects Tormund. The Hound rejects a tavern wench. Arya rejects Gendry, which kind of makes sense because, after all, she's got places to go and people to kill. Jon rejects Dany, which also kind of makes sense because she is his aunt after all. But then Jon rejects Ghost and sends him back to the wall with the other wildlings. This last rejection was the true heartbreak of the episode. Jon's raised this direwolf since it was a pup for a decade, and then he just sends him off without so much as a pat on the head? Brienne rejecting Tormund was just funny, precipitating my favorite part of the episode, which is where Tormund goes to cry on the shoulder of the least sympathetic man in Westeros, the Hound. The Hound's total disgust for Tormund and his heartbreak cracked me up so much that I actually had to pause the episode because I couldn't stop laughing. Then, some wench wanders over to hit on Tormund, and, in typical guy fashion, Tormund completely forgets all about his long-pursued love Brienne and runs off with this random tart. Next, we move on to Jaime and Brienne's alcohol-fueled late-night hookup, which at first seemed kind of fitting and actually romantic, especially once I heard that Jaime would be remaining at Winterfell while the others left just to stay with her. But then all that went out the window when Jaime snapped back to the old version of himself that we all hate and goes running back to Cersei, despite having just told Tyrion how happy he was being with her, and the fact that Cersei has now contracted Bronn to kill him. Speaking of which, Bronn has suddenly become a total piece of shit too. Despite being friends with the Lannister brothers for years, and reaping the benefits of being showered with gold and social status, he just turns on them like that. I know he's a cutthroat and all, but that seems pretty low, even for him, and just seems generally out of character. So he just pops in, pops Tyrion in the face, threatens them both, negotiates Highgarden for himself, then ducks out. The episode continues its downward spiral, with one of the dragons getting picked off effortlessly by Euron and his unstoppable fleet, who somehow knew that they'd be sailing back to Dragonstone that day, and just happened to be in the perfect position for an ambush at the exact moment that Dany's fleet was sailing by, and somehow managed to remain completely invisible until it was too late. Then Euron apparently captured Missandei, which they don't bother to show us, and then they're able to zip her back to King's Landing instantaneously to present to Cersei in the very next scene, who's ushering in the unwashed masses to act as a human shield. That night, Varys tries to pull Tyrion in on a conspiracy to overthrow Dany in favor of Jon, which Tyrion resists, but knows is probably the right decision at this point. I kind of think that Tyrion is going to snitch on Varys, who's going to lose his head as a result, but I guess we'll see next week. Lastly, Dany is also able to teleport through the same wormhole that Euron used to get to King's Landing, where she has this tense face-off with Cersei at the city gates. I really enjoyed this scene because it was so tense. I didn't know how it was going to play out, and for a second, I actually thought Cersei might surrender, leaving the last 2 episodes for Jon and Dany to sort everything out. But instead, Cersei stays true to her character and orders Missandei be executed on the spot. It was a tragic loss for both Dany and Grey Worm, but it was pretty cool to hear her utter her last words, Dracarys, essentially stating that her last wish was for Dany to burn this bitch up once and for all. But then, we're left wanting more as the episode ends with Dany having to retreat with her tail between her legs. I'm not sure why Dany agreed to this meeting before her troops could be reinforced, or why Cersei didn't just take this opportunity to open the city gates and let the Golden Company run out and swamp Dany's splinter force. Or why Cersei didn't have Tyrion shot to death with arrows, as she very clearly still wants him dead. There was a lot in this episode that didn't make much sense. It looks like they might be setting Dany up to be the Mad Queen, and how all of her friends except Grey Worm have now been killed, her lover is her nephew, and all of the remaining Starks hate her. I'm very curious as to how all this is going to play out, and I'm trying not to expect anything specific. But I really want to see the Hound square off with his brother, the Mountain, and finish the fight that they started in Season 1. And I'm really hoping that that last dragon is going to barbecue Cersei and Euron. After all, at the end of Season 2, when Dany was trapped in the Tower of the Undying, she foresaw a burnt-out throne room with snow falling, indicative of a dragon having laid waste to the Red Keep. Hey, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed my review, please like and subscribe, and comment below on what you thought of the episode and my review. And throw some theories at me as to what you think's going to happen in the next 2 weeks. And tune in next week for another episode of Rave of Thrones. Thanks for watching, Movie Real Rick.